And this one will be there as well. It's live streaming now, and it'll be recorded there later. Right? Fingers crossed. All right. Now we're live. Okay, great. So you all know, you're all here because we're all Lafayette fans, and we're all intrigued by his life, not only with the man himself, but the reactions and how our country viewed him and treated him and interacted with him for so long. And so when I was contacted by Ryan to have this talk and to carry his book in our gift shop, I was like, well, this is a perfect match for who we are and what we do. So without any further ado, please welcome Ryan Cole.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you all for being here and spending part of your Veterans Day with me. Do we have any veterans? Thank you for your service. It's fitting in a way that we're talking about this Veterans Day because it's kind of a story. Lafayette's return to America is actually the story of America's first generation of veterans and a celebration of their service. And that's one of many, many stories in the book. I was actually listening to, on my drive here, listening to David McCullough's Brave Companions. David McCullough, who obviously spent some time in Marietta, and he said something wonderful. He said, when you write history, you start with one person or one subject and one story or one place, and then it becomes 10. And in the case of Lafayette's return to America, it's 100. And Marietta is one of those stories. And actually, there's a lot of Marietta in this book, and it kept coming up over and over again during my writing of it. And the first conversation I had with a potential publisher, the editor who ended up working on this book, whose name is Austin Ross. I don't know if his parents here? Thank you for coming. Your son is very patient, a very talented editor also. But he's from Marietta, and he said, early on, he said, I'm interested in the book because I grew up in Marietta, Ohio, and I always knew there was a hotel, the Lafayette Hotel, but I didn't know the whole story. I knew he was here, but I didn't know the whole story, and he was intrigued by it. So that came up, and then again, as I was trying to write the book, came back to Marietta with one of the most dramatic moments in the whole story, which I'll get to. I don't want to ruin it, but I suspect you all know about it. It's the wreck of the Mechanic on the Ohio. The Mechanic was built here, and the captain, Willis Hall, was from here. I'm hoping to go visit his grave after we finish here. So Marietta is a huge part of the story. It's one of many, 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 many stories that are in my book. I can't share them all with you today, but maybe I can entice you to read the book. This is, as I always say, I think this is one of the greatest public tours of a private citizen in the history of our country. And I usually will say I apologize to any Taylor Swift fans who are in the audience. But are there any Taylor Swift fans here? Okay. That's okay. So, you're going to know some of what I'm going to tell you anyways, but this was one of the grandest celebrations that the country ever staged and one of the happiest periods that it would ever know. And I want to share with you the big story, but as I was looking through the displays before I came in here, I saw on the wall, it said Beyond the Pageantry, about the march in 1938 to Marietta. And I thought, that's a wonderful entry point into this talk, because you know that this tour of the United States was met with parades and processions, and people were fainting in the streets. And but I wanted to get at why. What was actually happening? Why were people feeling that way, and why were people reacting that way? And why was Lafayette greeted with such enthusiasm? And then why did he, as he toured the country, feel so proud of everything he saw in places like Marietta? So that's my story. The Marquis de Lafayette, retired on his farm, waits patiently a better state of things, writes William Eustace, America's envoy to the Netherlands in 1818. By that time, the teenager who had left his pregnant wife, a a disapproving family and king, to fight for the freedom of a people he did not know and a land he had never seen. The novice soldier who had grown into a major general, the French nobleman who had embraced America's cause and its Republican values, who had formed a father-son bond with George Washington, was an aging hero from the pages of Plutarch. He was widowed, his health was poor, and his finances were a wreck. And whether it's from his farm, LaGrange, 30 miles southeast of Paris, or a seat in the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of the French Parliament, he despaired over the fate of liberty in France and across Europe. Freedoms, the consolations from the incomplete French Revolution, which he played an early starring role and then nearly lost his head, are repealed by the restored Bourbon monarchy. Newly established constitutional governments in Spain and Italy and Portugal are stamped out by the Holy Alliance. But encouragement comes from communications carried across the Atlantic Ocean. They bring testimonials of the success of the experiment in freedom he fought for so long ago. They confirm man's capability of self-government, and they contain vivid descriptions of the incredible progress made possible by it. There are also tender letters from the remaining veterans of the American Revolution, the brother soldiers that Lafayette had not seen since his last visit to his adopted country in 1784. They transport him back in time, and they remind him of the emptying hourglass. Not long after receiving a note full of recollections from Joseph Bloomfield, who, like Lafayette, had been wounded in the Battle of Brandywine, he learned of the old soldier's death. We remain but too few survivors of that glorious period in which the fate of two hemispheres has been decided, Lafayette writes to Marinus Willett, another elderly veteran who he had fought alongside at the Battle of Monmouth. May it be in my power, before I join our departed companions, to visit such of them as are still inhabitants of the United States, and to tell you personally, my dear Willett, how affectionately I am your dear friend. Now, Americans took note of Lafayette's fortunes, and they were touched by his desire to be with his fellow veterans once more. Newspapers, there are 600 of them in the country at this point in time, published the contents of his letters expressing hopes for a final visit to the United States. During the summer of 1823, rumors begin to circulate that Lafayette indeed was prepared to embark for friendlier shores. But leaving France is as complicated as reaching America would be sweet. And the old hero won't cut and run. His absence, even for a while, would signal to the forces of reaction a battle abandoned. In February 1824, that battle is for a time concluded when Lafayette is voted out of the Chamber of Deputies. But just as his enemies in the French government seal his fate, Lafayette's friends in America conspire to revive his fortunes. In February, Congress passes a resolution formally inviting Lafayette to return to America and offers the use of a national ship to bring him there. America's minister to France, James Brown, arrives in Paris in the spring with a letter of invitation from President James Monroe. As Brown soon tells the president, Lafayette's heart is now set on a visit to America. There, he will reunite with his old brother soldiers. He will collect the evidence of the superiority of representative government and bring it back to France, delivering a rebuke to the monarchs of Europe. In the months that follow, Brown helps Lafayette arrange his affairs, pay his debts, and secure passage on a ship, though he politely declines the use of a government one. On July 13th, the packet ship Cadmus departs with Lafayette, his son George Washington, and a new secretary, Auguste Levasseur, destined for New York. But what awaits them across the ocean? 13 colonies are now 24 states, home to millions of men and women stretching from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi River and beyond. The economy, transformed by a second war with Great Britain, crashed in 1819, spreading misery far and wide. A passionate debate over the westward expansion of slavery, when Missouri is admitted to the Union, intensifies antagonisms between the northern and southern states. These stresses animate, in 1824, a very strange presidential election, although when have our presidential elections not been strange? This is a one-party contest between four men. The party is the Democratic Republican. The Federalist has ceased to be a player at the presidential level at this time, and they'll be out of business by the end of the decade. And the candidates are Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, and General Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans. Their partisans campaign along sectional battle lines and fight so bitterly, observers wonder if the Union can withstand the contest. In this part of the country, thus far, it is very evident that the sectional had prevailed over the national feeling, a Boston newspaper frets. In Georgia, an observer predicted that the new political tensions, quote, will bury our free governments in ruin, end quote. A Maine editor commented that the citizens piping themselves out of breath to the tune of the North and the South sounds too much like the death of liberty to suit our ears. But there was another subtext to this election. On the surface, it was best represented by James Monroe's pending departure from public life. Like every previous president, he had participated in the Revolution, either as a soldier or a statesman. Whoever succeeded Monroe would be the first of a second generation of Americans to lead the nation. And this transition worried Americans, fearful that they might spoil all that their dying fathers and mothers had built. As citizens moved towards the future, they glanced back at their past with a sense of painful nostalgia and a sense of historic homesickness. Accordingly, when, on August 15th, the Cadmus at last reached Staten Island and Lafayette once again stepped on American soil, the timing was auspicious. That afternoon, rain clouds cleared, and he was received at the home of Vice President Daniel Tompkins. A giant rainbow appeared, a sign, Lafayette says, of happy omens. The next morning, a flotilla of steamboats carried the newly arrived nation's guest, as he was to be called, to Manhattan. On board, a great reunion begins. As the boats pass citizens standing in the perches of forts and in front of homes, watching, screaming, crying, Lafayette is joined by his old brothers in arms, faces he'd last seen half a century ago, but recognized instantly. Among them was Marinus Willett. Lafayette had written to him only years before, expressing a wish that they may once again come face to face and embrace, and now they did. They sat down next to one another as the boat approached the city. "Do you remember me at the Battle of Monmouth?" Willett asked. Now Lafayette struggled to hold back tears. When the boat reached the battery and Lafayette stepped off into the old fortress castle garden, the greatest tour in American history commenced. Along the mile journey to City Hall, every building and house was draped with bunting and densely packed. Men shout and huzzah. Women wave and toss their white handkerchiefs. Bells clang, cannons thundered, and American flags fluttered. Some men even rushed towards the carriage and attempt to unhook the horses from it so they could carry Lafayette themselves. Quote, an entire people at the feet of a man, calling him their father, their benefactor. Lafayette's secretary Levasseur writes, letting fall on his hands and on his clothes the sweetest tears of gratitude, and then passing into the most lively and joyful delirium. Never has man had such a triumph. Now, the early itineraries to depart from New York for Boston, which is one of the first cities to extend a formal invitation, then travel back to Boston, and then towards Washington, the new national capital, which had not existed when Lafayette had last been in America, by way of Philadelphia and Baltimore. Now, there was purposely no rush to reach Washington in order to stress that this was a tour being undertook by a private citizen and not being sponsored by the American government. So on August 20th, Lafayette is on his way north towards Boston. On the road, which leads along Long Island Sound and into Rhode Island, businesses were closed in anticipation of his arrival. If his path did not run through their communities, New Englanders rushed to ones where it did. If he had departed before they arrived, these travelers embarked for the next town in hot pursuit. Schools were dismissed and the roads were filled with young boys hoping to catch up with the procession. The line of admirers following it grew so large that a cloud of dust kicked up into the air could be seen for miles and choked everyone in its wake. Even the horses pulling Lafayette were reminded of the weight and honor of their duty. When a new carriage was being equipped in a Connecticut town, its driver lectured one of the horses. "Behave pretty now, Charlie. You're going to carry the greatest man in the world." In Boston, where spectators sat atop balconies, on fences, in trees, or perched in windows, thousands of young students were arranged in columns to greet the nation's guest. In a moment of incredible theater, one broke ranks, stepped to Lafayette's carriage, where she was held up and slipped a crown of laurels over his head. On his return to New York in early September, a small army of artisans and laborers transformed the old Fort Castle Garden into an amphitheater to host the grandest ball in American history on September 14th. Quote, "To give an adequate description at any time would be impossible," writes a reporter after the party. Meanwhile, ambitious entrepreneurs in New York and its sister states capitalized on Lafayette mania, launching one of the first nationwide commercializations of a national event. Lafayette badges, uniforms, and canes were available in Virginia. Lafayette umbrellas in Baltimore and Philadelphia. Lafayette hats in Georgia. In Lexington, Kentucky, a tailor invented an innovative jacket for men called the Lafayette. It was cut without seams on the back or sides, supposedly eliminating the gathering of dust and providing a better fit. I can't confirm that. One New York newspaper took note of the Lafayette Gold Rush and wrote mockingly, "Little fruit boys run around our streets with their Lafayette peaches and Lafayette pears. It is amusing in what ways our countrymen and women contrive to get our money." Speaking of money, prices for food are so high before his arrival in Philadelphia that the city suffers a bout of Lafayette inflation, which I guess we would call laflation. The price of butter jumped from 12 cents per pound to 33. Eggs went from 10 to 20. There were no rooms available in the city or any of its adjoining districts. Never before had Philadelphia received such a sudden and immense influx of visitors. "You would not have recognized Philadelphia, so extraordinary was the change," writes one resident. And when Lafayette is pulled into the city on September 28th, it's in the middle of an elaborately choreographed procession modeled off of the Roman Triumphus, in which the returning generals paraded victoriously to the Temple of Jupiter, trailed by the spoils of war, prisoners, and treasure. Only, this is a far more Republican spectacle. Lafayette is accompanied instead by the city's militia, its artisans, printers, civic societies, and of course, the veterans of the Revolution. And his destination? The old State House, where the room in which the Declaration of Independence was debated and declared is rescued from oblivion and refurbished for his visit. Nearly half a century before, as an idealistic 19-year-old, he had arrived in Philadelphia a supplicant. Now he returned a hero. Where he had once been dismissed by a peevish congressman who warned him and his companions the United States government needed no more French adventurers, now he passed under a magnificent arch, over a carpeted platform, and into Independence Hall. That's right. We call it Independence Hall now because, in part, the place was rescued and refurbished for Lafayette's visit. In Baltimore, he landed at Fort McHenry, where Washington's old tents were shipped from Arlington, waiting. When one of the tent's doors opens, Lafayette steps through and into the past. Waiting inside were the aged veterans of the Revolution. Their brows, a reporter wrote, whitened with the snows of age. On October 11th, Lafayette left behind the cheering citizens of Baltimore and advanced towards Washington. There he visits the Capitol, the rotunda of which was just completed in time for his visit. He stops at the home of the president, James Monroe. The elite of Paris, Levasseur imagines, would not leave the White House without proclaiming, "Dear God, how this sovereign house feels bourgeois." And then, of course, on October 17th, the great set piece of Lafayette's visit to the United States, his return to Mount Vernon, and his visit to the crypt containing the bones of his adopted father, George Washington. Lafayette stepped into the crypt. When he reappeared, one who was present claimed later that he cried like an infant. Newspapers reported that a bald eagle hovered overhead. I can't confirm that either, but it's poetic. Okay, so by now you get the picture. Lafayette's return to America was the occasion for parades and parties and pageantry. and all sorts of euphoric behavior. And it was truly a phenomenon of popular culture. And like any phenomenon of popular culture, it had its critics, though they spoke mostly in hushed tones. What is our nation in regard to Lafayette? Asked Timothy Pickering, who was the old adjutant general of the Revolutionary Army. He's entitled to the lasting gratitude and respect of our country for his extraordinary zeal, bravery, and sacrifice in our cause. Nathaniel Greene, however, also a major general, was as much superior for talents and important services as can well be conceived. What were he living, would he think of the current national celebrations? The apotheosis of heroes in ancient times, when to idolatry was the public religion, must cease to excite our wonder. But to reduce the American reaction to Lafayette's return as just idolatry does it some injustice, I think. After Lafayette's visit to Mount Vernon and a celebration at Yorktown, he made his way to Monticello, where he rested for over a week with his old friend Thomas Jefferson. Then he visited with James Madison at Montpelier. The way there was delayed because of celebrations in Richmond, but also because of the election. The same bitter presidential election that had portended disunion and ruin was an object of far less passion after Lafayette arrived in August. The papers are very barren of news, and in this respect, the arrival of Lafayette has been most timely and fortunate, a New York editor wrote. Our party editors were getting too angry upon the presidential question, and we become so wearied with these squabbles. The same editorial even argued that Lafayette should be made vice president. Now, the Frenchman was appalled by that idea, but he was pleased by the reaction his return had inspired amongst Americans. And he surmised that it was not just about his presence, but it was the sight of all the old soldiers of the Revolution who had flocked to the events wherever he went, who stepped forward from the crowd, simply said, Brandywine, Yorktown, had embraced him, had grabbed him by the hand. It provoked a national reaction. And Lafayette took note of it. He said, I have the satisfaction of thinking that my presence has had a great effect between the two parties. Men who have not spoken to each other for over 20 years are brought together and mutually invited to celebrate us. All because, he wrote, memories of the Revolution have come back to life. Of course, the gratitude that Americans were feeling towards Lafayette and towards the soldiers of the Revolution was not evenly distributed. So here's an interesting Ohio aside. At the end of 1824, Congress awarded Lafayette a gift of $200,000 in a township of land for his services in the Revolution. A small group of Ohio congressmen were the most vocal opponents of the national gift for the national guest. And probably their leader was a congressman from Cincinnati named John Gasley. He argued that Lafayette was granted a fortune. While this was happening, many veterans of the Revolution were denied pensions and forced to beg for a crust of bread. $200,000 for Lafayette was a form of idolatry, not a sincere expression of thankfulness. It is national vanity in appearance and national gratitude by name only, Gasley argued, unsuccessfully. His fellow Americans were determined to disprove the old adage that republics are ungrateful. But even gratitude and the power of common memory can't stop American politics. In December, when none of the four presidential candidates won the required 131 electoral votes, as the Constitution's 12th Amendment stipulates, the field was culled to 3, Clay was eliminated, and the presidential election was thrown to the House of Representatives. Partisan passions were quickly revived, and the fear of violence and disunion rose once more. John Quincy Adams received threatening letters from supporters of his opponents. Some of Jackson's partisans even threatened to storm the Capitol should he lose. Lafayette, in the middle of the storm, avoided taking sides and remained optimistic. The Europeans, he observed, flatter themselves in thinking that the constitutional republic will be ripped apart by the violence of the candidates' 3 parties during this moment of passage from the veterans of the Revolution to the new men. On the contrary, they will see that everything will occur in the most reassuring way. And indeed, when the House elected John Quincy Adams president on February 9th, 1825, the crowds gathered at the Capitol departed peacefully. That evening, at a reception at the White House, Adams and Jackson graciously shook hands while Lafayette looked on. Now, what an incredible story this would be if it just ended right there. But I think the greatest adventure was still ahead. During his stay in Washington, invitations had arrived from the southern and western states. Actually, Ohio was not one of them, strangely. Most of these states, legislatures or governors, legislatures voted a resolution of invitation, and the governor would then send it to Lafayette. And Ohio was absent for some reason. But he still was determined to go there and visit every state he had not yet been to during the tour. So he waited in Washington during the winter for the cold weather to pass. And while he was there, his son and their friends in the Capitol, including many congressmen, organized an incredible journey. He would travel into the American South, all the way down to Savannah, swing to New Orleans, then up into the unknown of the American West. But there was a complication. During his visit to Boston in August, Lafayette had promised the planners of a possible new monument at Bunker Hill that should he still be in the country the next summer on the 50th anniversary of the battle, that he would attend a celebration there. That meant that Lafayette would have to travel through the South and West and be back in Boston by June 17th. That meant traveling 5,300 miles overland and on water. The trip would take likely 99 days and cross into 15 states. Time was of the essence. He skipped Adams' inauguration in March. He attended Washington's birthday celebration in Virginia on the 22nd, and then the following day, he boarded the steamboat Potomac, descended its namesake river, and the great voyage was underway. For the next 4 months, he traveled by stagecoach and steamboat on primitive roads and dangerous waterways. He rode through the Carolina pine forests by the light of bonfires in the dead of night. He presided over the dedication of monuments to dead heroes, to Cobb and Camden, Greene and Pulaski and Savannah. He raced steamboats into the port of Augusta. He was pulled onto the shores of the Chattahoochee River by a band of Creek warriors. An Alabama militiaman who was watching the spectacle called it the greatest show of a river crossing he had ever seen. In New Orleans, he saw the heartening spectacle of Frenchmen living under free government. He steamed up the Mississippi into the American frontier, reached St. Louis by the end of April, toured William Clark's Museum of Natural Wonders, and in the crowd of men and women who came to greet him, saw a familiar face that he'd never seen before. It belonged to a man named William Hamilton. His father, Alexander, was an old friend. In Nashville, he walked arm in arm with General Jackson. On the way to Louisville, as you all know, he narrowly escaped disaster when his steamboat sank between Indiana and Kentucky on the Ohio River. The Mechanic, which was built here and piloted by Willis Hall from Marietta. Now, I gave a talk last night in Hudson, and someone after the talk said, "What about the dog? What about the dog?" I usually don't like to mention it because it brings the whole event down, but Lafayette had been given a dog in Washington named Quiz, who had traveled with him, who was on board the Mechanic. Lafayette's cabin was the ladies' cabin below deck. When Lafayette came up to get on the lifeboat, the dog went down the stairs, water rushed into the cabin, the dog drowned. But it was a noble death. He was trying to rescue his master. And then there was a poem by Samuel Morse, the inventor of Morse code, who was a painter at the time and painted a beautiful portrait of Lafayette for New York City, wrote a poem about the dog, extolling his virtues and how noble he had been in his attempt to save Lafayette. So I'm sorry if I ruin anyone's afternoon. But, I'm from Indiana, so as a Hoosier, I'm naturally biased, but I think that the preamble to my state's invitation for Lafayette is one of the most poetic. And it read, "The felicity denied by a curious providence to the father of his country has, it is hoped, been reserved for his adopted son. What the immortal Washington was permitted only to see through the dark vista of futurity will be realized in the fullness of vision by his associate in arms and glory." So Washington had traveled into the Ohio River Valley as an envoy, as a soldier, as a surveyor. And he'd remarked on the richness of the land. He understood the importance of its commercial connections with the East and its suitability as a spot for settlement. Now, that glosses over dislocation, obviously, of the native population to make that happen. But Lafayette now, in a sense, was able to behold what Washington had anticipated. The shipyards in Jeffersonville, Indiana, the slaughterhouses, distilleries, and factories in Louisville, circus and theater, too. In the Athens of the West, Lexington, Kentucky, the seat of Fayette County, named in Lafayette's honor, was Transylvania University, the first college established west of the Allegheny Mountains, chartered by Virginia in 1790. Then it was on to Ohio, the site of wonderful improvements of the public and domestic happiness, which is gratifying to the American heart, Lafayette wrote. By May 19th, Lafayette had reached Cincinnati, the wonder of the West, the infant Hercules, with its booksellers and shipwrights and stone cutters and factories. Now, he had originally planned to travel overland from Cincinnati to Chillicothe, to Columbus, Lancaster, Zanesville. But by the time he got to Cincinnati, it was 6 days behind schedule to get to Bunker Hill. So instead, he had to travel along and then up the Ohio to get to Wheeling. So from Cincinnati, you all know this already, Lafayette steamed along the Ohio, and he visited ever so briefly in Gallipolis, and then Marietta for, I believe, an hour, right? I think he came to the home of Nahum Ward, who he had met previously, and Ward was in Europe, and they met. So, very brief visit, back on the river, and then landing at Wheeling, he traveled along the National Road, which was another one of Washington's ambitions. So, heading north through Pennsylvania into western New York, he then traveled along that symbol of American ingenuity and engineering might, the Erie Canal. And he left this wonder behind and rode nonstop towards Massachusetts and incredibly reached Boston on June 15th. Over 5,000 miles in carriages and steamboats, barges and packet ships. Lafayette had skirted the ocean, crossed on one great river, wrecked on another, rode through the forests into the frontier, sailed along the great canal. He had obliged almost every invitation, shook thousands of hands. He had memorialized his dead brother soldiers. And he made history by simply pausing for an hour in communities like Marietta that would remember the visit centuries later. No public person had ever successfully attempted such an endeavor. 2 mornings later, on the 17th of June, he met with the surviving veterans of Bunker Hill. One observer caught a glimpse of the scene. The soldiers, he wrote, their faces and frames seemed to have been made of iron. At 10 a.m., a procession formed outside the Massachusetts State House. Half an hour later, it moved towards Charlestown, passing 20,000 spectators who had all converged on Boston from every part of the Union. The crowds were so dense that the sidewalks and window frames were filled to capacity, and churches were opened to accommodate the crowds. Some even climbed onto and sat atop chimneys. You could rent a tree for the reasonable sum of $500. No one would even pay that much for Taylor Swift. At the line's front were the militia. Behind them marched 40 veterans of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Those who were able marched on foot, while others, having surrendered to the ravages of time, were carried back to the site in 8 carriages. One man held the drum he had beaten that day. Another swung a leather pouch over his shoulder. When the crowd asked where it came from, he said, Bunker Hill. Another veteran was dressed in the hat and coat he had worn during the battle, with bullet holes still visible in both. He also carried the shot bag containing the bullets he had brought into battle that day, swinging it from left to right. Across the bay, at the foot of the hill, Lafayette then helped lay the cornerstone in a Masonic ceremony. After this was complete, he refused to take his place under a covered pavilion, which was designated for the guests of honor to shield them from the afternoon sun. Instead, he took his place out in the crowd with the old men of the Revolution. He insisted that he was their representative, the representative of the old army. He sat under the hot sun, surrounded by a sea of heads with whitened or thinning hair, as they pressed silver trumpets to their ears to better hear the speakers' voices. Lafayette described Bunker Hill as his polar star, and the monument he raced across the country to help begin was finished in 1843. An obelisk stretching 220 feet into the sky, but also, as its planners had hoped, a generational bridge linking Americans to their original benefactors. In a sense, though this was not the end of his tour, this was the culmination of it. His presiding over the consecration of the memory of the Revolution, which had so rallied the country together in the lead up to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. There was a rapid tour of New England, a return to New York, Philadelphia, and a time of quiet, relative quiet, in Washington. Chance to travel into Virginia and say farewell to old friends, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Shortly before his departure from Washington to return to France on September 7th, Lafayette told a publisher named William Winston Seton that he was stunned by the magic changes across America, its wealth, its population, its artistry. Seton's wife, Sarah, wrote to her mother that Lafayette, quote, in the most touching strain, spoke of the springtime of his youth, when visions of hope were strong, and which in age he had the singular felicity of seeing realized. Now, I think it's remarkable that after 2 centuries, Americans still recall this tour. And as you know, over the last year, they have gathered together, sometimes in the hundreds, to celebrate in places like Marietta, where he only stopped briefly, where the landscape would be unrecognizable to anyone present at the time. Museums have relics, a footstool, for example, that they claim were part of the great celebration, sometimes with sketchy provenance. Families still tell stories, true or not, of how he danced with their ancestor at a ball or gave her a buckle from his shoe. What kind of event could leave memories that linger so long after it had passed? I think a beautiful reunion, a moment of national reconciliation, and a time to reflect on the singularity of our rights and institutions and offer thanks to the men who made great sacrifices to win, build them, and to keep them as well. The bicentennial of Lafayette's tour is over, as you know, but the story of his farewell, I think, can inform how we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration and our Revolution. For example, it reminds us of the importance of serving a cause greater than ourselves, of revering our veterans, of the power of common memory to help us find a place to come together in shared citizenship outside of politics, though politics is important. And it reminds us that our revolution is ongoing. Lafayette crossed the ocean to seek affirmation of the success for the cause for which he had fought for so long ago. And he had found it. As he wrote to a fellow Frenchman, "You cannot imagine how I was struck by the miracle wrought here by 48 years of independence, instruction in government, and liberty. It surpasses my imagination, I know." But thrilled as he was by the progress Lafayette beheld, he did not ignore areas where the revolution was incomplete. "There's only one issue for which I am less resigned than ever, and that is slavery and anti-black prejudice," he wrote from New Orleans. But rather than scold his hosts or denigrate their advancements and achievements, Lafayette, who had long opposed slavery and searched for ways to end it, spoke by gesture. In New York, he visited the city's free school for black children. In the South, when cities had prohibited slaves or free black men from participating in celebrations, he visited in plain view with black soldiers who had participated in the revolution. In New Orleans, he met, by request, his request, with a battalion of free black men who defended the city with Andrew Jackson. He told the people of Gallipolis how lucky they were to live on the northern banks of the Ohio River where slavery could not breathe. He gently pointed out the hypocrisy of that wicked institution in a nation dedicated to the rights of men, the same nation who he had helped free. Lafayette could take incredible joy and pride in the progress he beheld across America, but also signal to its citizens and leaders where great work remained. Now, I think Lafayette would unapologetically argue that the world is better off because of America. He might confess that we have some imperfections, but then add that the framers and founders left behind the means for future generations of Americans to address those imperfections and continue the work of their revolution. And I think that is one of the legacies of Lafayette's tour. And I think it's the charge of every generation of Americans, and it's the story of our nation over the last 250 years. Thank you. Questions?
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to leave then. I'm just going to leave it at that. Don't be shy. Yeah.
I can tell you a little bit about this hour in Marietta.
Please do.
You mentioned Dan Ward, one of our early settlers here. He had a beautiful home which no longer exists that sat facing Putnam Street between Front and Second. It would be behind the Penny's building, if you all know where that is. And there's a long sidewalk going up to Nan Ward's house. Children were released from school on the day he visited. Cannons were fired, guns were shot off, and people lined the sidewalk going up to Nan Ward's house on both sides. And he paused and shook every hand. He picked up every child and kissed them before he got to Nan Ward's house, where they toasted many, many times over with his old friends from the Revolution. So I have that image in my mind of his visit, and it must have been a wonderful day.
It's incredible. I keep going back to the fact that he was in so many places for such a short period of time, and that legacy continues on. I had a friend who grew up in Macon, and they passed through Macon, whose mother, still claims an ancestor danced with him at a ball. And I don't know if it's true or not, but it just showed to me as I was researching and writing the book what a huge, I think it's fair to say, certainly in the time between the ratification of the Constitution and the Civil War, one of the biggest events in the history of the country. But I love hearing that. Where was Ward's house in relation to the museum? Is it?
Let's see. It's
I'll take you by.
downtown.
I'm gonna.
Okay.
We're gonna do a little tour, everybody, after the talk.
I was telling Aaron, even if I wasn't here trying to promote a book, I'd still want to come here. I'm excited to be here.
Go to
as a
Putnam
history.
Street in Front and Second.
Okay.
The
Thank
land,
you.
the office over there.
Yeah.
I was just in Marblehead, Massachusetts a couple of weeks ago, and I saw a plaque to Lafayette's visit. So did he go? He must have gone.
He must have gone. I don't. Oh boy. So he was.
It's east of Boston.
It's east of Boston. So
I took a picture of it.
in August of 1824, they left New York and then they went up and went along Long Island Sound and to Rhode Island and then got to Boston. And then they went further, and that must have been at that time, because then they went further north and east and then back around. So I bet that's when that was, probably. Yeah, it had to been, because they only came as far east as Boston on their way back in June. So I bet it was in 1824. It's pretty cool, though, that all those plaques and there's all this. I mean, I'm from Indiana, and I was just talking to some friends in Jeffersonville who were involved in the celebration there, and they knew everything about it. They knew every veteran of the Revolution who showed up and shook his hand, and it's wonderful. But I also think that I didn't have limited amount of time with you today, so I can't get too far into it. But I think it's more than just the parades and the processions. I think the country was feeling something at the time, set of gratitude and anxiety. When you write a book like this, sometimes you realize something after you've already submitted the manuscript. You have this aha moment. It's like, oh, it's too late. But I realized where I live in Indiana, I live in Monroe County, Indiana. And if I drive north, the next county is Morgan County, named for Daniel Morgan. And then if I keep going north, I get to Marion County, which is named after Francis Marion. And the next county is Hamilton County. And if I'm in Monroe County and I go to my west, it's Greene County. If I go a couple counties over, it's Fayette County, named for Lafayette. These were all named in 1818, 1819, 1820, so in the years before Lafayette returned. So obviously, the second generation of Americans who settled places in the then West, today Midwest, were thinking about the Revolutionary generation. And I think Lafayette returned here at the right time. The whole confluence of things happening, but one of them was this nostalgia, and it just, I say, boom, he shows up. There already was this anxiety and nostalgia, and you have this huge celebration. And
I found the picture and the date.
okay,
Okay, and this is part of the Lafayette Trail.
that's I've got to be legit then. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, making the farewell tour. Lafayette's tour on August 31st, 1824. General Lafayette was received here at the Marblehead Bank. He was addressed by John Prince on behalf of the town. That's all.
That's
Right?
great.
Yeah.
You know, it was such a, one of the things I loved about researching this was that at every town or city you went to, it was such a huge deal to give the address when you showed up. And if you're an aspiring politician, you got to get it right. So I was looking at when he was in Indiana, we had a weird political situation where the governor who had invited Lafayette had been elected to the Senate before Lafayette appeared. So there was an interim governor who was then seeking his own term, and he gave a speech of welcome, which was a fine speech. You know, Lafayette had to endure hundreds and hundreds of speeches, some of them not so, not that. Yeah, there's a great, the financier Vincent Nolte, who helped Lafayette settle his debts and then was in New Orleans when Lafayette got there, wrote in his memoir that Lafayette, it was like, he said Lafayette just had to endure terrible speeches, and he asked Lafayette how he did it, and Lafayette said supposedly, I listen, and then when I hear something that I can then give my response about, I stop listening to the speeches. I don't know if that's true, but that's what Nolte wrote. But I was going to say, in Indiana, this James B. Ray, who was going to run for his own term as governor, was attacked in the partisan press for his speech. You've disgraced Hoosiers by giving this terrible address for the nation's guests. So it just shows you how pervasive this whole thing was in the country at the time.
I look at the number of places here in the United States
Yeah.
that are named Fayette or Fayetteville
Yeah.
from all over the country. We have one in West Virginia.
Yeah.
I didn't even think about that.
I think we've got, in Indiana, we've got Lafayette City, we've got Fayette County, and we've got LaGrange, too. Yeah, I was asked during a talk about the number, and I some historians have said 300 maybe, but I don't think you can actually, are named for Lafayette, and other places are named for the other place that's named for Lafayette, or they're named for someone named Fayette or Lafayette, so it's hard. But I always say, that's amazing, so many places are named for him, but also a mountain, a lake. In Nashville, there was a professorship named for him, babies named for him, that men's jacket in Lexington, Kentucky, named for him. It's really astonishing how many things were named in his honor while he was in the country and then afterwards as well. That's it?
Oh, I got a question.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about communications, and I'm always just stunned by how prolific writers were of an era. But knowing that Levasseur and Lafayette, and not only were they writing and were there things being published in newspapers here, which, relatively new, people being able to see the news on a weekly or monthly basis, but sending things to Europe to be printed in their press as well. Do you see this as a time of yes, we look at the dawn of the telephone and things changing, and the dawn of the internet and people finding things out. Did this seem like an era where now Lafayette's visits helped fuel the ability for communications to spread a little bit better? Or was it just happenstance because transportation was improving as well? Or
I think it's all of those. One thing I didn't say when we're talking about the presidential election and all the kind of the environment before Lafayette comes is a period of great change, economic change, and then the advent of commercial steam travel. I say kind of roughly it's like the internet at the time. It reduces distances for people and goods, including newspapers. There's some advancements in printing that create a proliferation of newspapers. So you have this incredible amount of newspapers, and you have the ability to transmit news across the country. I thought something fascinated me was that I was reading about when he got to New York in August, and then I think it was somewhere near St. Louis. It was in Missouri, so the farthest reach is west. they had heard about it very soon afterwards and were already having bonfires and illuminations. He was in the other side of the country, but they knew about it. So I think the technological advances ushered in the canvas, but then I think one of the reasons this was such a national celebration, and Lafayette himself remarks upon this in a letter, was because newspaper editors were so fixated on the presidential election, and there were so many partisan presses, and then they just lost interest because Lafayette was so much more interesting that helped decompress the situation. But I think it was yes, it was happening at the time, but it played a part in why this was such a big event. But one thing about communication, this is I'm using your question as an opportunity to talk about something, is that as I was looking through all those letters, Lafayette's letters, I was really lucky that the Lilly Library on the campus of Indiana University is 2 miles from me. And they have a fantastic collection of Lafayette's letters and a lot of stuff, kind of the paraphernalia from the tour. And I was there one afternoon, and I encountered in the file very long letter that was written by a woman whose name I didn't recognize. And my first instinct was, because I didn't have a lot of time before they kicked you out at 5, I should probably need to put this back and look for a letter written by Lafayette. But I eventually decided I should look at it, and it was written by a woman who I think was from Albany or Buffalo, and she traveled down to New York City on September 6th, Lafayette's birthday in 1824, where there was a big Society of Cincinnati, New York Society, Cincinnati had a big celebration for him, and she snuck in with some friends, and it's all in the letter, and she talks about how she gets in, and the guard comes and says, this is only for members, this is only for the society. And then Marinus Willett, who I mentioned in my talk, shows up and says, no, let the lady stay. And then Lafayette walks in. And so she's describing this whole, what it feels like to meet him and to shake his hand, and what an honor it was. And that's great. So that's an eyewitness version of that. But then she digressed into what it meant. And she said, the whole country's gone crazy. Everyone's Lafayette mad. And then she kind of circled around and said, if there was ever a person or a moment to lose our minds, this is it, to give thanks to Lafayette and these veterans of the Revolution. And I was so captivated by that I then spent, the remainder of the time researching and writing the book, and Austin can verify this, because it took so long, searching for those letters to have as many people's eyewitness accounts, people who we've never heard of before in communities, who were writing at the time or in recollections or memoirs what it was like to meet him. And that really drove, those communications really drove the narrative in the book.
When did you get interested in studying Lafayette and starting the book?
I'd heard about the tour.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people had kind of heard about it and knew the spectacle and what a huge deal it was. And then there have been a couple really good Lafayette biographies over the last 10, 15 years. Mike Duncan's book, and then my favorite is Laura Ricchio's book is beautiful. I mean, so in both those books, it's like a chapter maybe. And I was so captivated by that. And then other books, just not on Lafayette, but on the history. It's very interesting, that period in our history is very interesting, growing, the rising republic and the tensions and strains that eventually lead to the Civil War. So I was interested. I like Lafayette. I think he's a very admirable, fascinating guy, historical figure. But I didn't want to write a book about Lafayette because I felt like I didn't have anything to contribute in terms of a biography. But taking him and then putting him in the center of this event, and then telling all these other stories. Like I was talking about that David McCullough quote about the first story was Lafayette and this tour, but then the next story was Francis Wright, who was a Scottish reformer and one of his proteges, who came to America at the same time, traveled kind of with him at some distance, but then decides she's going to try and end slavery while she's here. So her story's in the book. Edward Coles, who was the governor of Illinois, who met Lafayette in St. Louis, had been born in Virginia in the same mountain range as Jefferson, had been Madison's personal secretary, grew up on a plantation. His father had owned slaves, decides he can't reconcile the values of the Revolution and these men who he idolized, moves to Illinois, to the Northwest Territory, frees his slaves, takes his slaves with him, and frees them on the Ohio River before they get to Louisville. So I wanted to tell all those other stories And, you know, the story of Willis Hall, the captain of the Mechanic. So I thought it was a wonderful opportunity to take Lafayette and then paint a picture of that year in the country and all kind of the preceding years. And because it fascinated me, and I thought it was a great story. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
If you want to visit a place that still exists in the area that Lafayette could possibly have been to, the building that once housed the law office, or the land office of Nahum Ward, is very close to where his house used to sit.
Yeah.
Today, it's the law office of Fields, Vessels, and Demlow, and it's on Second Street, just around the corner from where I was explaining, opposite the courthouse. The building is still there, that was Nahum Ward's land office.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
And they're very history friendly.
they would love to have you visit.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you for the tip.
Mhm.
Yeah.
With regard to the development of communication technologies at the time, we need to remember that the U.S. government has taken over the Postal Service.
Yep.
And so the Postal Service would have been a major trunk for that kind of communication to move
Absolutely.
forward.
Absolutely. And interestingly, the Postmaster General at the time helped Lafayette plan the tour into the South and West because of his knowledge of.
He knew the roadways.
Yep, that's exactly right. It's a great point. Yeah. I think that's in the book. I can't remember. I think I put it in the book. Anyone else? Well, thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. Thank you. Thank you.